And so by signing on to this precept, it probed for me, what does this mean for me, right? What does it mean, from my Brahmin ancestry, that we've been consuming dairy, and how has this aligned with us as Brahmins who were supporters of ahimsa. We're supposed to be the priestly class that set the standard on following core tenets like ahimsa. Like, how does this all play out with my ancestry, my culture? So I was having to ask these deeper questions that I wasn't necessarily asking myself as I was watching What the Health, in 2017, or making that transition from vegetarian to vegan, having to acknowledge and accept factory farming, and doing the research to see that in India, there's potential cruelty too.
Welcome, everyone, to the Spiritual Forum. I'm so glad you're here. Just a reminder, thank you for supporting this podcast. If you want to support it anymore, just engage and subscribe to my YouTube channel, and you can always donate at thespiritualforum.org. That's enough said for my run-up. I want to introduce you to my guest, Pria Acharya. She is an MBA and a certified mindfulness teacher, filmmaker, narcissistic abuse recovery coach, storyteller, activist, gardener, and vegan cook. This is a Renaissance woman. She was born in India and with roots in Rajasthani Brahmin culture, and she was raised in the United States and blends ancient wisdom with modern clarity to inspire compassionate, mindful living. She's a filmmaker, and her film is called Do No Harm, and it explores the ethical implications of dairy consumption. And her new book is called Go Vegan Mindfully: Barriers, Breakthroughs, and Vitality. And it explores how mindfulness can support compassionate and sustainable living. Welcome, Priya.
Thank you so much, Carol, for that beautiful introduction. I'm really honored to be here. My journey has been about weaving mindfulness with compassionate living and discovering that releasing old conditioning, whether cultural or personal, can open us up to deeper alignment with our values. So that's really the heart of what I share in my book, Go Vegan Mindfully.
Well, that's great. Why don't we talk a little bit about mindfulness? How do you define mindfulness?
So I would define it as just present day awareness, present moment awareness of our experience, of our internal, external experience.
Okay, so how do you go about becoming like a mindfulness teacher? Why don't you tell us your story a little bit about how you got to becoming a mindfulness teacher and an activist and also an author and filmmaker?
Sure, certainly. So um, I got divorced in 2017. And at the time, I went through various narcissistic abuse recovery programs. And the common theme that kept getting presented was mindfulness. So I became increasingly curious about how does mindfulness connect to healing. And so that led to my joining the certification, 2-year certification program with Tara Brock and Jack Cornfield through Sounds True. And so my initial interest was in having, an additional tool to be able to offer my coaching clients who were also going through narcissistic abuse recovery. So I wanted to be able to share with them, this has been my experience of healing from trauma with mindfulness, and I wanted to be sort of an experimental guinea pig to be able to share directly, like, this is how it helped me, so I could offer it to them. But as I went through the program, we got to a point of discussing the precept of not harming, of do no harm. And we actually had to sign an agreement around it. and what it meant for us. And for me, that really aligned with and highlighted my veganism. I became vegan in 2017 along with divorce because I felt liberated to be able to do that because it had been a hindrance and an obstacle in my marriage. And I no longer had that. So I had been vegan a few years. And so by the time we were discussing this precept, for me, it was a natural alignment. Like, well, of course, veganism for me meant that. It meant we aren't participating in harm. So, and there was also spiritual harmony with that. And but it wasn't something I had been necessarily thinking about with my mindfulness program. Again, I was there to learn about healing and recovery, but it's having that part in my program really created a shift for me, because part of the training was for us, me and my classmates, 2,500 global classmates, to discuss what this precept meant for us as we were signing on to this agreement, because we were going to also be teachers of what this precept meant, right? Which included concepts such as compassion. And so I was very struck by realizing that most of my classmates were not vegan. And I was, listening to their stories around that and how they justified the consumption of animals and some various stories. And so this became somewhat of a spiritual shift for me in the program. And that's when I think I began shifting my focus on mindfulness and this training and aligning it more with veganism, leading to eventually, after graduation, starting the short film and then now this book.
That's an interesting story. So you're really, I think, fairly recent convert to veganism. 2017 isn't that long ago. 8 years. That's not too long to become an activist and a filmmaker and then writing books. And it's interesting that it intersected your recovery and training in mindfulness. It doesn't intersect most people. So what do you think that is? I mean, like you said, most of the people who were in this training with you weren't having the same experience about, questioning how to expand our compassion to animals. So what was it with you, do you think, that caused you to get on this journey?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I became a vegan after being vegetarian my whole life, along with my
Okay.
entire ancestry. So my shift was, I had never eaten animals along with my ancestry, but there was dairy in my life. And so for me, it was more of a shift from letting dairy go. And why?
Okay. Okay.
So it was a process. I can't say I have one day I became vegan. It was a process. And also as a mother, having to create the shift in my home. So part of that included, for a little while eating my daughter's, finishing off my daughter's dairy.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a overnight get rid of all the dairy. There was a transitional shift, and I think what happened for me in the program was, it's one thing, because I don't think being vegan is just this, it's just this one black and white switch, it's a journey, because even when we're vegan, what I learned is there can be a deepening of the journey, right? And so by signing on to this precept, it probed for me, what does this mean for me, right? So not only was it that I, not been by then having consuming dairy or meat for sure, which I never had, but it was more than that. It's like, well, what does it mean, in from my Brahmin ancestry, that we've been consuming dairy, and how has this aligned with us as Brahmins who were supporters of ahimsa? We're supposed to be the priestly class that set the standard on following core tenets like ahimsa. Like, how does this all play out with my ancestry, my culture? So I was having to ask these deeper questions that I wasn't necessarily asking myself as I was watching What the Health, in 2017, or making that transition from vegetarian to vegan, having to acknowledge and accept factory farming, and doing the research to see that in India there's potential cruelty too. And so I was having to do a lot of soul searching. So it wasn't just hearing my classmates and how they were navigating this path, or potentially spiritually bypassing, potentially doing mental gymnastics to have things reconcile for them. I had my own personal experience, spiritually as well, of like, what does this mean for me? What does this mean for my ancestry? And I also learned through the program, learning more about mindfulness, that it, originated with my Brahmin ancestry, and they used mindfulness to memorize like Vedic scriptures. It was a tool for them. And then it went to Buddhists. And so this was news for me. So it added this greater component of like, how does mindfulness relate for me? And to really want to connect with it. And, what did my ancestors believe around ahimsa? And, you know, trying to reconcile the cruelty around dairy, like what is happening in India. So I started asking questions of my relatives, and I wasn't getting clear answers. So I ended up going to India, and Do No Harm, the short film, explores that journey, my own trying to reconcile and understand this, you know reconciliation of my ancestral roots around ahimsa and dairy. So very much, I think, involved with not just Hinduism, religiously, but spiritually. For me, I needed to feel alignment as a mindfulness teacher.
Mhm.
Uh, I needed to feel clear.
Mhm, mhm. Okay, so you've said a lot of interesting things there. First of all, that the journey is not necessarily one day you awaken and you decide, I'm going to change, and everything's different the next day. I had a similar journey. I remember the day I decided to go vegetarian. It was in 1973. I don't remember the date, but I remember exactly where it was, and I remember announcing it to my mother. When it comes to giving up dairy, it was, to me, it was a much slower awakening process. I was vegetarian for decades, and then suddenly I was reading in a book about dairy, and I learned about it, and I didn't change overnight. It was because dairy had been so much a center of my diet for the prior, 4 decades. It was harder to give up, and I can't remember when I finally went vegan, but it was somewhere in 2010, 10-ish, and it was I had to phase it out. So it sounds kind of similar with you. I know there's several documentaries coming, maybe not coming out of India. I think some are coming out of India, but about India and about the dairy industry there, because I think it is shocking. I've tabled at the Parliament of World Religions, and we table there as ethical, spiritual vegans. And we've had people from who've actually come there from India, and they're like, we're vegetarian, but cows are treated very well in India. And you're kind of like, well, are they? So why don't you tell us a little bit? Because I think dairy is one of the best kept secrets. I think a lot of people know about factory farms. They don't like that. They try to get their meat sourced ethically another way. That's a whole nother conversation, whether that's possible or not. But most people, I think, are very ignorant still about dairy. So can you share with us what it is about dairy that is at odds with compassionate living?
Oh gosh, yeah, there's so much there. I'm trying to figure out where to begin. So there is the cultural, religious context in India. So there is this religious Hindu narrative around Krishna. So we Hindus we've grown up with imagery around Krishna and dairy, and much of it, frankly, can be misinterpreted. But there's a lot of paintings of baby Krishna stealing milk, and he's a cow herder. So I think some of this whole, I think, delusionary idea that, oh, we're so nice to cow, it comes, I think, partly from this. We grew up with this imagery of like, we're so nice to cows, and it's partly originating from Krishna, And so I think this was partly my hindrance too, as I was transitioning, and why I don't have a day that I became vegan. Why I had these stories I was telling myself, because one of them initially was, well, the factory farming issue, I don't think it probably exists in India. So
Mhm.
maybe, like, if I get dairy from the Indian store, like, that's from dairy from India, like, that could be okay. So there were all these kind of stories, right, of justification. And, I kept having to probe further to get to kind of the truth. And going to India, I got to see that. So filming for Do No Harm, I was fortunate enough to get connected to several dairy farms. And so I visited one. This was turned out to be a dairy farm that my mother's neighbor and friend owned. And so I made several trips there. And I think it was my first trip that I saw a deceased calf to the entrance to where the cows were milked. And so the babies were kept to the right, about 6 feet away, sectioned off, and with barriers. And then to the left were where the cows could be milked. And so the mothers could literally look at their children on the other side. And so to this entrance, I saw a calf, and initially, the calf was fully exposed. And so I was trying to process this and film this. And then later, I noticed that they covered the calf. And later, my video editor noticed that the stone that they covered was even like shaped in a heart, which was
Oh.
interesting. And so I'm noting all of this, filming all this, trying to absorb reality. Meanwhile, I'm seeing my mother get buffalo milk delivered every morning, and I open her fridge and it's just full of dairy. There's the milk, there's the yogurt that's made every day, and just full of it. And so I'm processing and observing all of this. And then we go another trip, and then I see a calf who is tied. And I ask a staff member there, what is happening here? And so he explains, well, this calf was just born last night, and the calf was trying to go to mom to nurse. So we had to tie him up to keep him from doing that, because the milk is, we have to milk the cows for people. And so we don't want the calf to take that. And so I'm trying to absorb all this, right? And this was the calf that's pictured, that my book is dedicated to. I called him Baby Brown Cow, little boy, Baby Brown Cow, and he was just this adorable brown calf that really didn't look that much different than my brown Aussie Shepherd Lab dog. They're almost like the same size. And he had this white heart on his forehead, which I've noticed is so common with cats. It's just precious. But and I noticed in this picture that it seems like, and there's a cow behind me who's kind of like alertly watching. And I imagine she's probably mom, observing her calf. And so I was petting this calf, and I started to make the connection that what's happening here is this is the male calf. And what I happened to see with the deceased calf was regular process. I just happened to come on a day where they had left their deceased male calf to for pickup. And what's happening here now with the baby brown calf is he's heading that way, right? He's being starved. And this is the dairy industry in India, and I heard that my experience of going to the dairy cow farms is not something typical of Indians. They're not going to these farms, and that's not happening in the US either. So,
Mhm.
in that sense, it's not different. The reality is hidden. I had an opportunity to witness it, and it's not transparent in India, nor is it here. So, it's not to shame or blame my fellow Indians, because it's the same here.
Mhm.
It's just more camouflaged here, because I probably couldn't as easily go to a farm and witness such a clear picture of what's happening. But it's pretty much the same. And so the point of the film was to expose this, not to shame, but just kind of open, the window. And this is what's happening. This is what's been happening around dairy. How does dairy happen? You know, and that it's not possible to separate it from the cruelty, or to somehow think that there is compassion
Mhm.
in this, to do the mental, spiritual, emotional gymnastics around the truth and reality. And again, it's not to blame or shame anyone, because again, there I was, right? I loved dairy growing up. I, had vanilla ice cream on Air India on the way over as a 7-year old. I loved it, and so it's just to open the lens for all of us is the point of the documentary, and I was part of that. I was lied to just like we all have. I was conditioned just like we all have.
Yeah, it is really interesting. I love that you're not about blaming or shaming. Nobody wants to do that. We don't want to do that. And all of us have come from a culture where dairy is okay. I mean, all we're born into that. So unless you're born vegan, which a few people are, we've all gone through this having this veil over our eyes and having no idea. And like in the US, you see the trucks with the happy cow on it. You think, oh, yeah, cows, the cows are just providing milk for us because they've got extra milk. And you don't even think about the whole impregnation that goes on, the taking of the calf. And how does that check at all with our values of love and compassion and nonviolence and family, family and honoring women, honoring the female and honoring children and knowing that children belong with their mothers. And it's such a contradiction. But like you say, we go through these mental gymnastics and or we just cut it off. Like, don't tell me about it. I don't want to know. I just want my ice cream. I just want my cheese. I just want my yogurt. I don't want to know, or I want to pretend that everybody's happy on the farm. It's like, when I was a kid, we had a dog that was a problem dog that my parents sent off to the farm. The police actually came and got Duke and took him off to a farm. It's fake, we want to know what's true. Us spiritual journeyers, we want to know what's true, and we want to live a true life, and we want to live in alignment with our values to the extent that we can. So I think you're doing a great service trying to at least expose what is true. What is true. And that poor little baby, that just breaks my heart.
Yes, it really breaks things down, when I was face to face with him was so emotional for me. I was so full of grief after visiting with him, and I just cried all the way back to my mom's home, just kind of quietly, peacefully on my own under my sunglasses, sitting in the front seat so no one was really aware of this very personal experience I was going through. Because I really couldn't have this conversation with anyone to so that they would understand it. But for me, it was huge. It was to meet him personally, to know that there are so many like him, right? There
Yeah,
are
yeah,
so many as adorable. Just because, we don't see them doesn't mean they're so precious. And I had this privilege of seeing such a beautiful being, and to know like he's going to die, you
yeah,
know? And there's nothing I can do directly for him, indirectly maybe, with trying to create awareness. Um, and I was grief stricken, so much so that after that I even got sick,
mhm,
and so yeah, that was kind of very much an emotional turning point of having to reckon the truth and reality of what's happening, was meeting him face to face and touching him and experiencing just the very kind of simplicity of what's happening here. He's trying, this is a mammal, this is a calf going to mom to nurse. Like, what's more simpler
Yeah.
and sacred and beautiful than that? That's just such a core aspect of life, right? Yeah, I feel like there's so many threads one could talk about along those lines. Like, what does this mean for our gender, for motherhood,
Yeah.
and how it's valued or not? But there's so many things we could talk
Yeah,
about, you
yeah,
know?
it is, it is. I do think, I mean, I talk about this on Mother's Day, it's like celebrate Mother's Day by not, by not consuming dairy. We want to honor all mothers and motherhood, and mothers and babies belong together. I I think, we talk about enculturation, you talked about Krishna. Christianity, we have Jesus and fish, and there's all sorts of uh, reasons to doubt that any of that was true, but that was some of the writings. And so we use these things to justify. But when we think about it, first of all, we're not in those times. We're in different times. And we're in our culture now. Our culture, I don't know how you feel about it, but I feel, in fact, I just posted on Facebook, I said, let's make humanity human again. I, I feel like we are so disconnected from our heart, and we're so disconnected from seeing the other, beholding the other. Like I am looking at you, Priya, and beholding you as an amazing, spirit-filled human being. And we're so cut off from that. And so it's so easy to just yell at each other online, or take a political side and say everybody on the other side is wrong and bad. It's endemic of a real sickness in our society. And I don't mean to dwell on that, but I think this ability to turn a blind eye to a child, to a child, and your baby brown is a child, who just wants his mother. How can we turn away from that? How can we, and say that we're still really, compassionate humans? We need to really delve into this. Like you say, don't make anyone wrong, don't blame, shame. We've all been enculturated in this way, indoctrinated. But now let's wake up and decide, who do we want to be? Do we want to be these beautiful human beings with compassion and empathy and care for each other? Or do we want to be just so disconnected from life? I think that's what's really up for us now as a society. Do you see the same thing, or do you see something else?
I do. Yeah. I want to point out something you said earlier along those lines that I think is significant. You said that, we're not all necessarily born vegan. And I hear that a lot. And it's true in one respect, that we are not we're not necessarily born into vegan homes.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah,
just want
you're
to
right.
clarify, because I think this is relevant.
Yeah.
The purity of it is that technically we are all born vegan, right?
You're right. Yeah.
We are born to, just like this calf, we're mammals. So I think it's important to recognize the simplicity and the purity of this, because
Yeah.
it's really not that complicated,
No.
right? We're mammals like this calf. We were born to nurse from the milk of our mothers. I'm a mom twice, and so I've gone through this process. And the milk is, we know, like, that we're supposed to have the milk of our moms. That is the most pure, sacred thing, for our existence. This is how it works. And then what happens, right? It's conditioning, right? What happens after this? How does dairy milk enter our world,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
and so I just think it's important to recognize this. Like, what shifts after, this phase, after we have our mother's milk? And I think it's important to recognize the point at which the conditioning begins, right? It's like, we don't question it, right? Well, how did milk appear in my life? Well, I'm sure my mother presented it. How did she learn that this was her? So there is this whole kind of generational conditioning, right? And that's what it is. And I think it's important to recognize that. You know, it's very simple. We're mammals. We drink our mother's milk, and then at some point we were societally externally taught that this milk from another species is normal. And we went with that. Just like I don't think it's that different from believing in Santa Claus or believe but, we
Yeah.
grew out of those kind of stories, but then,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah. We didn't grow out of
uh
the other one.
continue to believe that this other story is normal, and it's a little bit of magical thinking, right? And I participated in it. I wanted to believe, yeah, happy cows, we treat the cows. But yeah, there is a level. I think it's important to there is a little bit of magical thinking here, and it's not to be again to shame ourselves because yeah, this is how we were raised. But I think for spirituality and for growth, it's and for mindfulness, we have to be able to break through those conditioning, right? We cannot be continuing to live on delusions. um, we have to face the truth and reality and live from that place of being truly present and conscious and aware.
Yeah, right. I mean, I like what you say, magical thinking. It is kind of childish thinking, childlike thinking, it's like we believe that everybody's happy and that this is
Yes,
for us. It is a
that's that,
belief.
that's so comfortable, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, it's a
We
belief.
want to be comfortable.
Yeah, and to the spiritual path to me is really about releasing all of the conditioning. We've got to get ourselves down to the base, who we are as spiritual beings, and question everything that we've learned. And it's not just a matter of keeping what works and getting rid of what doesn't work. It's really a matter of looking at truth and, and looking at who we are and what is reality. And where did I get this idea? Where did I get it? And we inherit these things generation after generation after generation after generation after generation. And probably in just 2 generations, we stop asking questions. You know, we could do the same thing with something absolutely insane. I mean, yeah, we I'm not gonna bring up what could be more insane, but maybe someone comes up with an idea that's a great idea to separate human moms and babies. And because whatever reason, and then they do it, and then within 2 generations, that seems normal. We need to question everything. And what you're bringing up to people is just you're just sharing the truth, like this is the reality. And I am all about reality when it comes to the spiritual path. It's not about escaping reality. It's not about pretending reality is different. It's about looking it straight in the face and then you deciding who each of us deciding who we are in this matter. Who do I want to be? Do I want to be a person who's responsible for that little brown cow just starving to death? And in the US, it's different. The male cows go to veal crates, or they go directly to like pet food or something like that. But the same thing, they're separated from their mother. They're not fed. And who wants to be a part of that really? Especially if you're on the spiritual path.
Definitely. And so what I go into in my book, Go Vegan Mindfully, is kind of a continuation of this conversation. I'm trying to enlighten like what's happening. I want to bring forth this idea of conditioning and how we have been functioning, just to bring some light to that, so we can understand sort of our own process and bring some mindfulness to that, some awareness of how it is that we have been conditioned, right? So you brought up a good point. There is the conditioning, but also I think as maybe as part of the magical thinking is that there is herd mentality. You know, so I,
Mhm.
I bring forth these concepts, right? So it basically becomes about why do people eat meat? Because other people eat meat, right? And
It's
it's not
normal. We've
rational.
always done it.
Yes, that's what was so now you're making me question what we've always done. I'm not going there, you know? You're not gonna make me have to completely unravel everything I've done my whole life and then my parents have done it's too much. Forget it, So that is very much about herd mentality. So I'm bringing forth these concepts just to bring awareness about humanity and how we live. You know, it's like you can present an idea and then enough people do it, then it's okay. And then there's herd mentality. And so there's a lot of social psychology around various scenarios of how this works. We do the thing other people are doing
Yeah.
because we want to be part of a tribe. We want to be part of a community. It's very threatening for some, vegan activists to be like, "Oh, you're wrong. What you're doing is wrong. What your whole community, and family and generations have been doing is not compassion, it's not wrong." And I realized that also even with mindfulness teachers, that it's difficult. It was difficult for most of my classmates to accept and reconcile that any change was potentially warranted, or even as mindfulness teachers, that they would be willing to look at this further to see discrepancies or conflicts. It made me realize that, I think it maybe created more compassion for the general population, because I felt like if this is difficult for my classmates who are supposed to be teaching mindfulness and compassion.
And probably your teachers too.
Yes, my one of my teachers, yes, was is no names,
Yeah.
is not vegan, and wrote about compassion, and so it was very challenging for me around, what am I learning? So I thought it was really important to sort of focus on this segment of the population and to share my story around this journey, partly to share that, I don't know, maybe to feel more compassion. It's like if it's difficult for mindfulness teachers to navigate, then perhaps people who aren't getting that training could be more self compassionate as they navigate through the challenges and the barriers around having to dig through the conditioning and looking at it to see how does this align for you or not.
Yeah, the herd thing is really interesting. I do think that's something that's very hard for people to do I want to stand up and be different from my family, from my group, from, whoever it is that I'm hanging with, wherever my classmates. And how is it at a meal? Do I want to be the one eating differently or causing a little trouble or even bringing attention to myself? And for some reason, I was okay with that. For some reason, I was okay with that. That hasn't really been a problem for me, but it is so challenging for so many people. And I think that's also how we're conditioned, and I think that's how our brains are wired. Our brains are wired to be in a group, find safety in the group. And so if I stand apart from the group, I think there's something very visceral and something very and ancient roots, that maybe I'll be kicked out of the group and then I'll be on my own and I can't live out here. I mean, I think it goes down to something that primal with people.
It is. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And yeah, so I bring forth these ideas, these concepts. So partly it's just to create awareness for ourselves, right? So as we navigate this potential journey, that we're not shaming ourselves, to create understanding. It's that this challenges these challenges we're feeling, it's normal, it's normalized, and we're not the only ones. It is primal, it is very primal to survival for us to fit in with our families and our communities and not be left behind by the herd, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Because we are not similar to them, so it makes sense. But growth, requires us to fully see that, to fully see, yes, I feel compassion, that this is a primal part of me. And so I won't shame myself. At the same time, you know, spirituality requires us to explore these ideas and to figure out, like, is this where I want to remain? Or why am I here? What am I here to just try to fit in with the herd, with whatever is externally presented to me and I conform? Or do I question? Am I a seeker as part of my spirituality to to see what resonates with my heart, what makes sense, what does compassion mean to me? Does compassion include that I participate with an industry that allows calves to starve? Calves who aren't really different from my dog, you know, um, or the pigs, and they're what does this all mean, and how do my values align with how I live? I think spirituality requires these questions, and mindfulness requires us to pay attention, to live in alignment with the truth that we're experiencing and finding.
Yeah, the spiritual path is not an easy one. It's not all love and light and feeling good, and it's not all being together and singing and holding hands and praying together. It really is a tough road. And sometimes I wonder if we just didn't even create this whole earth plane for us to be in this place to challenge us in such an extreme way to grow through it and push through it and say, I am going to take this compassionate choice, even if nobody else does, because it'd be easy from a soul standpoint to just do what everybody does if we created a world where everybody was compassionate. So I guess what I'm saying is sometimes I wonder if with this world is it made for us to grow through it, and then as spiritual people we make decisions for ourselves about what is the right, moral, ethical, and loving thing to do. It's a hard path, and we're up for it. We're up for it. We can each do it. So, what I'm really interested in is, let's say somebody's listening and they've just learned about dairy, for example, for the first time, and they're questioning this, and they're looking at, oh gosh, I'm kind of seeing this conditioning, and I'm kind of seeing this herd thing that I'm doing. What do you tell that person? What steps should they take after the initial awakening?
Yeah, I think, it always begins with self-compassion, right? Um, that first we have to kind of note, like, what is happening for us individually. We have to first be there for ourselves, so that we're there, to be conscious of, are there parts of me that are trying to shut me down, like, oh, no, 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 you're bringing up stuff that's going to kick us out of the herd or whatever. So to kind of, if there's grief, to not run and hide from it. I think this is partly what you're saying about, the spiritual path isn't easy. It is tough because part of it is that we have to leave room for pain and grief, right? I had to leave so much room for all the grief I felt for all the years I had dairy,
Hmm.
where I didn't question, where does the milk come from? A basic question that is, addressed in, my film and the trailer for Do No Harm. And so it has to begin with compassion. It's like, oh gosh, the grief, to allow it, but then to sort of to be there for ourselves, for mindfully be present for ourselves, for our grief, and to sort of go through it, right? Not the mental gymnastics around it, but through it. Like, this is the truth. This is how it feels. This is I what I participate. I didn't know. I had this ignorance. And at the same token, if we can recall this own journey for us, this compassion we had to bring for ourselves, we can then extend it for others, because it does begin with us. So if I can be compassionate about my own ignorance, then I can bring that compassion to someone else and their path and their journey. They may be at a different place, but to be able to meet them where they are and offer them compassion for where they're at. And so I think that's where it begins, is if people are starting to connect the dots, to kind of allow that. I mean, if it brings some painful feelings, like, there has to be some opening to allow that to come forth and pass through, as we know about any healing, right? That we can't avoid, go around it. It's just pretty much we have to go through it.
Mhm,
And
mhm,
mindfulness is, I think, very helpful with that, because as we learn, meditation can help with being more still with our experiences and being present and offering ourselves compassion, resource as needed if the pain is too much, and to be able to come out on the other end, by going through it.
I think it's a trauma healing. Do you think it's like a trauma healing?
I think so, very much so. Because it was very painful for me to think like, oh, I'm this, do-gooder, who is doing the best I can spiritually. Like, I don't eat animals, and I used to do speeches for vegetarianism as a teenager. So I was kind of an activist for pretty much my whole life. And I really didn't hear about veganism as a teenager. I was interviewed for Vegetarian Times. I did original oratory for my debate team in high school and quarterfinalist in North Carolina. I memorized a speech overnight on vegetarianism. So I'm like, in a sense, still the same person, right? And now I just wrote this book on veganism. But um, there is this grief. It's like, God, I thought like I I knew it all, or like I navigated everything, but I didn't, that there was this huge piece that was left. And so there has been a lot of grief and pain around that. Like, I really didn't get the heart of ahimsa, as a
Mhm,
Brahmin Hindu, and trying to reconcile like what that has meant for my ancestry, and wanting to, like, carry my lineage, my history, and not letting my ancestry down,
mhm,
and
mhm.
so that's very much a part of why I wrote this book, why I did that short film, is like, this is my offering. This is how I can be a mindfulness teacher, and perhaps by reading the book, it will prompt that kind of slight discomfort for someone to want to start connecting the dots for them. And listening to you, like in terms of spirituality, like, why are we here? I was prompted to remember the quote, like, I think we're here to walk each other home,
Mm,
right? And for me, like, I had to first sort of walk myself home, it's like, of course I'm still in that process. I think we are for the rest of our lives. But then, as we're individually walking ourselves home, we kind of need to be walking each other home, not just mindlessly join the herd and wherever the herd is going, but to bring our consciousness to the table. And I think that's why we're here, right? We're trying to go home. Our soul is trying to go home. And that's what we're trying to do individually, spiritually. And I think that's what we're trying to do for each other, right? And I hope my like book makes a little dent in sort of beginning that navigation for a reader to potentially figure out, like, what does this mean for you to go home, and be aligned and live aligned. And so I think that's what we're trying to do, don't you think?
I love
Spiritually?
it. I do. I love that. I've never said that before, but I love it that we're here to walk each other home. It's a solitary journey, and yet we reach out our hands to those who want to come along with the journey, and we also walk together. And we're all going to end up going home. I do believe that we're all going to make it. We're all going to make it. But there's so much awakening to do, and you start off by saying self-compassion and going through grief. I completely get that. It does help me. I have a call with people every Tuesday morning. We pray for the animals in around the world, and we pray for the awakening of humanity. And we're also reminded that we're not awake. It's like, okay, so we've got this piece of it. Like, I woke to this piece, but that doesn't mean I'm awake to everything. So I always ask, spirit, God, source, show me what I cannot yet see. That's my regular, constant prayer. It's a challenging prayer because after I say, after I make that statement, usually something shows up. It's like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that. So it's a continuation of the journey. It's not like once you get dairy, you've got it all. That's one big piece of the puzzle, and then there is more and more for us to awaken to. so that we can walk in alignment with ahimsa. And I forgot to define ahimsa. I tabled at my church Unity Convention in June, and I have a retreat this October next month. And the theme is Homo Ahimsa Rising. And the idea is that we as humans, so we are evolving from Homo sapiens, which is the wise human, which hasn't demonstrated that much wisdom, to Homo ahimsa. Homo ahimsa, ahimsa is like nonviolence, not harm, reverence for all beings. I was really surprised to find out how many people don't know what that word means, but it's very, very deeply embedded in the Indian culture. And it's been in here since the 1800s, but a lot of people still don't really know what that means. But it's a wonderful word. I like it. It's a wonderful word. It's unconditional love. It's love with no boundaries. It's compassion. It's comfort. It's reverence for everyone. And I think people on the spiritual path overall align with that conceptually, the idea of it. But then to put it into your heart and then put it into your feet and your hands and actually live it really requires us to not be blind, to wake up and to pray and to ask to be awakened over and over and over again. And that together we do this and together we walk each other home.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I was just thinking that, the word ahimsa is so known like in India,
Yeah.
but like here, like around the word compassion, um, that I think the majority of people, aren't necessarily asking themselves every day, like, am I living according to ahimsa?
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
am I fully aligned, with ahimsa and with what I'm consuming? And um, I was amazed, like, with my mindfulness training, it also includes like mindful eating. And graduating from the program, I was amazed to see, like, on various mindfulness apps, like demonstrations of mindful eating. But I never saw anything on mindful eating that did not include veganism. And I thought, wow, like, we've got mindful eating that includes, like, mindfully eating the turkeys at Thanksgiving, and, like, we're supposed
Saying
to be
grace,
mindful.
yeah, saying thank
Yeah,
you, chewing
and
slowly.
yeah, it was like a dark comedy, It's like,
It is.
wow, you know? We've just taken mindful eating to a whole new level. And so it's just, yeah, all of this was, like, I think spiritually for me, telling me, guiding me, like you were saying, like, constantly, like, asking, like, what does this all mean? Like, please, God, spirit, like, help me navigate, like, where am I supposed to go with this? And so that's, I think, what it's meant for me,
Mhm.
is that I want to express my feelings and thoughts on my experience, and that is kind of was the origin of the short film, um, that's been in post production, paused for funding, and then the book on veganism and attaching my experiences around mindfulness. And so it's, yes, just to add to what you're saying around ahimsa and compassion, and how we can know these words and these terms, but it's a whole other thing to be mindful about how we show up in the world, and are we in alignment really with these concepts and principles. Carol, it's just amazing to me, just at the level of the lack of connection with them, because I was just reminded that I was at a talk by a Buddhist monk, for Dharma Voices for Animals,
Oh,
on their behalf, because they were trying to compile a list of Buddhist vegan leaders. And so I was, at this presentation, and this monk even talked about compassion for all beings, which is just a phrase that I feel like is so thrown out easily.
it does.
But then his assistant, yeah, shared with me, like, oh no, he eats meat, because he wants to be athletic, and that's kind of common in Tibet, and not only was I the only vegan, but she was like the only vegetarian there, at this gathering. And so, yeah, I just add that, again, maybe it's for compassion for all of us who maybe aren't living in alignment with compassion and ahimsa, just to say that even a leader who is giving a talk on compassion is not in alignment, you know. And
Yeah,
so
yeah,
it's
yeah.
It's kind of almost the norm to live without the alignment, just to.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, that's the problem with the majority, and it's not even the majority; it's the vast majority. I mean, what is culturally accepted? I mean, we could culturally accept human sacrifice. I mean, that was accepted a long time ago, and we look at that and go, "That was an abomination." But there was a time when humans did that, and it was kind of normal. And so it's the idea that we need to keep doing what we've always done is something that I think is part of the herd, but it comes down to uh, who do we want to be going forward? Who do we want to be going forward? And um, that's a whole nother journey. It doesn't matter if I'm the only one, and it doesn't matter if every single one of the ancestors that went before me engaged in something that I see as not being compassionate. Am I going to do it? Am I going to say, I don't want to participate in this anymore? And I do have sympathy and empathy for everybody who thinks that we're crazy now if they've made it this long in this recording, because we've all been there. We've all been there. But I do think the spiritual path calls us forward, and that's what you're accomplishing. Now, I do want to acknowledge you for being so much in action since 2017. That's that's amazing that you've written the book, that you're making this film, that you made this trip to India, that you made yourself look at something, right in the eye, that you've made different choices, uh, all in like 8 years. That I just want to acknowledge you for really putting feet to your heart and your beliefs, because most of us don't know what to do. And so we kind of do what we can ourselves. And that may be perfectly fine for most of us. But I think it's amazing that you've done as much as you have in such a short period of time. So I just wanted to acknowledge you.
Thank you so much. But I have to say, like, I think veganism is very much, I think, also about social action, right?
Yeah.
Because just the fact that someone is vegan and is making a choice to live that way is an act. It's a radical act of social justice. So they're doing the same thing.
Yeah.
They're putting their feet to the fire. They're putting their feet in alignment with their beliefs, right? With every meal that they're choosing to have, they're making a statement, right, about their beliefs. So that's something I love about veganism. Like, how accessible is that, right? Basically, you can save the planet and your soul by your choice around your next meal, your next lunch. And I love that it's so accessible. I think a lot of people feel lost, like, or even spiritually, like, I don't know what I'm doing with my life, or I don't have a sense of purpose. And veganism can almost like offer that. Like, this is simple thing that it's about your next plate, what's on it,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
what a difference you can make, right? And spiritually, it is an act. So veganism is about putting spirituality in practice. It's about putting legs to compassion.
I love it. That's true. That's true. Thank you for reminding me that every single meal we make a choice, and every single meal it can be a choice for social justice if we choose. And so that in itself is activism, and that is itself, really making a difference in the world and in our spiritual path. Before we close, and I want to give you the last word, but I think maybe we want to address a few, I should have done this earlier, but maybe a few of the myths about maybe that it's hard, or that it's expensive, or that it's, that you hear things like veganism is for the elites. There's all sorts of things that cause people to not want to step into it. Can you address some of those roadblocks and myths?
Absolutely. I mean, I come from India, where it was just very really common and easy to be able to eat plant-based whole food, outside of the dairy. There are a lot of options. So a lot of my diet is that. I mean, it can be, healthy grains and lentils, beans, and so there's a lot of just very simple, cheap ingredients. And so I think there's a lot of misconception around that, and I address that in Go Vegan Mindfully. And of course, if there are people who have been conditioned to enjoy the textures of meat, we've never lived in a time when there have been more options
Hmm.
that can allow people to still kind of have a similar taste. And I'm amazed by all the products here. I arrived in the US in the 70s, and I would get the question as a 7-year old, like, "What do you eat? Lettuce?" And I can say, like, it's been decades since I got a question like that. So there has been progress with a realization that there are options, and it's increasing all the time. And meat is not cheap. It's subsidized. Dairy is subsidized. And I think one of the challenges there can be with veganism is that it doesn't have the support, such as the dairy and the meat industry, and being able to subsidize it. But there are so many ingredients that are very cheap: rice and beans and lentils, grains. And produce, things that people can grow themselves. So there are a lot of options, and it's even if there is subsidies for meat and dairy, what it's doing to our bodies is just a whole other expense conversation,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So what in terms of medical care and the shortened lifespan. So that's a whole other long conversation.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, different ways to look at the expense.
Yeah, and all of that is in your book. So, well, Priya, this has been really fun to talk to you about. I've talked to other vegans before, but we really haven't gotten into dairy as deeply as we did, and I think it was really important. So, thank you for doing that with me. Can you share any last words you may have? If there's anything that we didn't cover, what message you may have, if it didn't come out in our conversation, I'm going to give you the last words.
Yeah, I just hope that it is, apparent just how simple it is to just kind of begin small. And I encourage people to just, make some small changes, even if it's meatless Monday, trying few dairy free options, trying oat milk, trying soy milk, trying some tofu recipes. And a lot of times, as we know with our habits, when we start making the small changes and build on that, we can kind of get further and further on a potential plant-based journey.
That's important. That's really important because I think it looks like this big, huge, ominous, huge shift, and I can't do that. It's too big. And people, you could take little bites, little bites, little steps, baby steps, and to just commit to maybe even taking a baby step once a week is 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 a big step. And it's a big step for the animals, and it's a big step for compassion, ahimsa, everything, and your own spirituality. So I really appreciate that message. Thank you.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, just like with exercise,
Yeah.
sometimes we walk a little bit more, and then before we know it, we're running or maybe even doing a marathon. I think it's very similar with the plant-based vegan journey.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Thank you, Priya. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you everyone for listening. I think it's a really important message, and I just wish everyone the best and on their spiritual journey, and encourage you to consider this as definitely an aspect of your spiritual journey. So thank you, Priya, and thank you everyone for listening. And I now close the spiritual forum.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Priya.